The role of an M60 machine gunner in the Vietnam War was not just another assignment, it was one of the most dangerous, brutal, and mentally draining jobs that any soldier could take on. The M60 itself was an incredibly powerful weapon, often called the pig, because of its heavy weight and the way it ate up ammunition. But the men who carried it were not just soldiers, they were marked men. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army quickly learned that if you take out the machine gunner, you cripple the entire firepower of a platoon. That simple fact made the M60 gunner one of the most heavily targeted men on the battlefield. The M60 was a beast of a weapon. Weighing around 23 pounds without the tripod or ammunition, it was heavy enough to slow a man down. But weight was not the only problem. The machine gunner also had to carry belts of 7.62 mm ammunition, which were heavy in themselves, often draped across the body or carried in large boxes. On top of that, the gunner needed a backup weapon, usually a sidearm, because when the M60 overheated or jammed, and it often did, the gunner was suddenly a sitting duck in the middle of combat. So imagine trudging through thick jungle, in brutal heat, with mosquitoes biting, leeches clinging, and your back bent under the crushing load of gear. That was daily life for the M60 gunner. Now here is where things got even more terrifying. In combat, the M60 was the backbone of squad firepower. Every unit relied on it to pin down enemy forces, to keep their heads down, and to blast through ambushes. Because of its devastating firepower, the gunner immediately drew attention. The second the gun roared to life, the enemy would zero in on that position with everything they had: rifles, grenades, mortars, and sometimes even rockets. The gunner's job was not just about spraying bullets. It was about standing firm when every instinct told you to hit the dirt. The machine gunner became the lifeline of his squad, and that responsibility was both terrifying and crushing. The noise of the M60 was unmistakable. Once fired, its loud, deep rhythm cut through the jungle like thunder. Soldiers described it as both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because it meant their own sided firepower, horrifying because it meant the enemy knew exactly where you were. Many gunners would say the sound of their own weapon was a death sentence echoing out into the jungle. And they were not wrong. Casualty rates among M60 gunners were far higher than average riflemen, precisely because of how quickly they became targets. Now imagine this. Your squad is moving down a trail, thick jungle on both sides, when suddenly the world erupts in chaos. Bullets whip through the trees, and you hear the sharp cracks of AK-47s. The first instinct of most soldiers is to hit the ground, but the machine gunner cannot stay down for long. His job is to set up, swing the pig toward the source of fire, and unleash a wall of lead. In those few seconds, while everyone else is diving for cover, he is fully exposed. This is why many gunners did not live to see old age. They had to sacrifice their safety for the survival of their brothers in arms. The physical toll was just as brutal. The M60 overheated quickly during sustained fire. That meant gunners often carried asbestos gloves so they could switch out the barrels, which would glow red, hot after only a few minutes of use. In the chaos of combat, trying to swap a burning barrel while rounds zipped overhead was nothing short of insanity. And when the weapon jammed, the gunner had to fix it on the spot, under fire, with shaking hands and sweat pouring into his eyes. Failure to get the pig back in action meant his squad could be overrun. Interestingly, the M60 gunners were rarely alone in their suffering. They usually had an assistant gunner, often called an A gunner, whose job was to carry spare barrels, extra ammunition, and to help load belts. But even then, the weight was overwhelming, and the stress was unbearable. Many gunners admitted that they knew their chance of survival was far lower than the average soldier. Some said that every firefight felt like flipping a coin with death. Something that made their job more terrifying was how the Viet Cong adapted. They were masters of ambush. The M60 gunner was always their primary target. Snipers would wait for the gunner to reveal his position. Sappers would throw grenades toward the sound of the weapon. Entire squads would focus fire on him to break the backbone of American squads. In some chilling accounts, gunners recalled watching their ammo belts run dry as the enemy kept advancing, knowing full well they were seconds away from being overrun. The jungle itself was another enemy. The dense vegetation made it hard to set up a clear field of fire. The gunner often had to fire through brush, not even sure if his bullets were hitting anything. Sometimes, the pig would chew through so much foliage that the gunner ended up cutting down trees instead of enemies. Yet the enemy always knew where he was. The bright muzzle flashes in the dark or the loud roar of the gun gave him away, making him a glowing target in a sea of shadows. Then there is the psychological burden. Soldiers often spoke about the haunting knowledge that everyone depended on them. Riflemen could miss a shot or stay low and still contribute. But if the gunner faltered, if he froze, if he failed, the entire squad could be destroyed. That mental pressure weighed heavier than the ammunition belts across their shoulders. Many gunners later admitted that they lived in a constant state of fear, knowing that every engagement was likely to end with them. as the first casualty. Another chilling detail is how close the combat often was. In Vietnam, firefights could erupt at ranges of only 20 or 30 meters. That meant the M60 gunner was not just laying down covering fire at a distance, he was blasting directly into the faces of enemies who could practically reach him. There were countless accounts of gunners firing until their barrels warped, watching bodies pile up just yards away, all while knowing more enemies were circling around. And here is something that many forget: the gunner's job did not end with firing. He had to manage his ammo carefully, because running out in the middle of a firefight was a death sentence. The pig fired around 500 to 650 rounds per minute, and at that rate, entire belts disappeared in seconds. So the gunner had to balance suppression with conservation. That constant calculation, how much to fire, when to pause, when to swap barrels, was happening all while bullets cracked past his head. What made the M60 gunner's job even more brutal was the aftermath. After firefights, these men often had to clean their weapons under exhaustion, patch their gear, and prepare for the next ambush. Sleep was rare, rest was never enough, and paranoia was constant. Many said the sound of their own weapon echoed in their heads long after the war ended. It haunted them, along with the memories of being the most hunted man on the battlefield. The M60 gunner was a symbol of power in Vietnam, but also of vulnerability. The machine gun could hold back an entire enemy company if used right, but the man behind it always paid the price in fear, exhaustion, and blood. These were not just soldiers with a weapon. They were living targets marked the second they pulled the trigger. It was a terrifying role that demanded courage few can ever understand. In the end, the terrifying job of an M60 machine gunner in Vietnam was not just about carrying a heavy weapon into battle. It was about carrying the weight of survival for an entire squad, about standing tall when everyone else hit the ground, about firing through fear, exhaustion, and the certainty that every burst could be their last. The story of the M60 gunner is not just about a machine. It is about the men who carried it, knowing full well that being behind the pig made them a target every single time. Yet, they kept firing, kept moving, because their brothers on the line depended on them. That is courage under fire in its truest form. The M60 was heavy, brutal, and unforgiving, but its strength came from the soldier willing to shoulder it, no matter the cost. Steel alone never wins a fight. Flesh, blood, and grit do. If you want to hear more untold stories of war and the warriors who lived them, stick with us. Hit that subscribe button, because this is just the beginning. You have been watching Iron Front, where history is remembered the way it was lived, raw and real.